Welcome, everyone. Just going to wait a minute as people log on, and then we'll get started. Greetings, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We're just going to wait another minute as people log on, and then we will get started with this event. Well, welcome, everyone. My name is David Sandalow. I'm the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and I'm a member of the selection committee for the Zayed Sustainability Prize. And it's my honor to bring together these two organizations today for an event on ending energy poverty, certainly one of the most important challenges of our time. Today, at least 1 billion people around the world live in energy poverty. By some measures, several billion. We had a discussion about this among our panelists before the session. We could continue that, but about how many people there are. But whatever the exact number, it is far more than is morally acceptable. And I believe that this is a time of stark contrast when it comes to energy poverty. On the one hand, we have within our means the ability to end energy poverty, perhaps for the first time in human history. We have the wealth globally, we have the technologies that allow us to bring electricity, to bring clean cooking, to bring energy in all its important forms for human beings to everybody on the planet. And that, of course, is absolutely fundamental for modern life and for human development. But at the same time that we have this tremendous potential, the short-term trends are very dire. And particularly in the last 6 months, of energy prices have skyrocketed in industrialized countries and around the world. The impacts in emerging markets, the impacts in some of the poorest countries in the world have been nothing short of terrifying, with people losing access to energy who had it before, and a slowdown in momentum in our efforts to end energy poverty. And we have a remarkably accomplished group of speakers today to talk about this topic, and I thank them for taking the time to join us, and thank everybody listening for taking the time to join in this conversation as well. So let me start just by briefly introducing our distinguished panelists. We have Gauri Singh, who's the Deputy Director of the International Renewable Energy Agency in Abu Dhabi. We have Harish, Hande, the founder and CEO of Selco, and Mansoor Hamayun, the co-founder and CEO of Bboxx. And maybe I'll just start by asking each of them to say a word about their background, kind of how'd you come to this, and what are you doing today? And let me start with you, Gauri Singh.
Thanks, David, and it's great to be on this panel. And thanks to Zayed Sustainability Energy Prize that we've got a chance to talk about energy poverty. And I have to say, I mean, my background is that I have worked with government and with governments in my international role at IRENA. I've also had the pleasure of working very closely with community. So I do understand, how communities can come together and really create the kind of opportunities that you don't consider them capable of. So, I do think that this is something, energy poverty is something that doesn't get talked about too often. I think it's it's a discussion which happens pretty much on the margins of large conferences, and I think it needs to take center stage.
Thank you. Harish, to say a word about your background and what Selco does.
Thanks, David. Nice to see you after a long time. And thanks to Zayed the Prize for putting this up. And yes, I got into this industry when I had little more hair than Mansoor decades ago. And and so it was, yes, started Selco with some of my colleagues in 1994-95, looking at energy poverty as a means to development per se. And today the criticality of energy poverty is not only from a moral or ethical perspective, it's also, I mean, yes, this is number one, but two is if we have to truly do development in a climate resilient manner, that blurs the lines between adaptation and mitigation, energy poverty solutions will create that platform of development, leapfrog a lot of the poor into the next stage, and also help a lot of the rich and the middle class get solutions from the innovations that happen because we are dealing with energy poverty. And that Selco basically uses SDG 7 to democratize the delivery of health, education, livelihoods, and saying that it's like the basic salt of any ingredient.
Thank you. And we're going to come back to these ideas. Mansoor, please tell us about your background and what Bboxx does.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Like many of us here, I was sort of shocked at the fact that nearly a third of mankind either has no access to electricity or extremely unreliable access to energy, right? And that's something that in today's age, I consider to be super unfair. And the more you think about it, electricity in particular is so essential in ensuring an acceptable quality of life, like to be able to live a modern, productive life that's ethically necessary. Electricity is so fundamental to that. And as an engineer, I was sort of very, very intrigued by all of the other stuff going on as well. Modern batteries, solar panels becoming cheaper, energy efficiency, IoT, digital payments coming together. So back of all of that, that technical revolution that was taking place, as you mentioned, David, a lot of the technology exists today. And seeing this big problem, I helped to found Bboxx. It's a company that installs solar panels and batteries across Africa on payment plans, and people pay us using mobile money. When they pay us, things switch on. When they don't pay us, it switches off. And today we provide electricity to nearly 4 million households across Africa. In places like Rwanda, nearly 10% of the country is provided electricity by us. And so it's been a really, really exciting growth. And if I may just end on one of my main exciting point is that really what's happening is that some of the poorest people in the world are making some of the smartest choices in the world. They're becoming renewable clients first. They're becoming carbon negative first. They're producing their own electricity, storing their own electricity, and being metered and paying digitally. That's really the future of energy, and it's happening first among some of the poorest people in the world. And for me, that's such an exciting thing about leapfrogging energy poverty and the future ahead of us.
Well, thank you. And I just want to highlight that if you've got a question from the audience, please put them in the question and answer box. And we're going to make this as interactive a conversation as we possibly can. And it's just remarkable to see the comments that are coming in the chat for those who are looking. I mean, we have people who have said hello from, I think, at least a half a dozen countries so far, maybe more. We've got, I just see Jamaica, Fiji, Nigeria, Venezuela, Dubai, New York, El Salvador, and more. So, you know, when I say that we have the means to address challenges that we never had before, this is just a great example of it. This type of ability to have a global conversation in this way wasn't possible, you know, 5, 10, 15 years ago. And I believe we need to make sure that the type of technological revolution that makes this type of global conversation possible is then fully mobilized to bring energy services to the people who need them. I think we're we're doing that in part, but not in the way that we fully could. And Gauri, let me just come back to you and ask you about ARENA and your work at ARENA. Of course, ARENA's focus is on renewable energy. It's the International Renewable Energy Agency. Could you just draw the links between renewable energy and energy access and energy poverty? How does renewable energy help, and how can it help to close the gaps and bring energy to people who need it? Oh, and
thanks, David. I think, one of the things that we're all getting aware of is that renewables is now becoming the cheapest source of generating electricity. But that's, when you're looking at utility scale plants, the megawatt size plants, and which also, of course, have a very major role that they can play in providing the energy access. But at ARENA, we do think that while we need to continue to support governments to have policies that can increase the deployment at scale, so you're talking megawatts and gigawatts, and support them to get the best practices and be able to reach the more vulnerable communities that still don't have electricity. But also at the same time, we are working with a number of countries to look at very local solutions. And when I talk about local solutions, we're really looking at what is it needed by a farmer who's producing, say, in Hindu Kush, in the Hindu Kush Himalayas, is producing buckwheat. Then what is it that he needs in the form of energy to be able to process his produce and get it to the market with a better price? And those are the kind of solutions we think are extremely exciting. And you do have the ability to look at the multiple solutions that can be offered to a farmer who's sitting in Bhutan, or maybe a health technician sitting in a place in Burkina Faso to be able to make sure that vaccines to children reach on time. So when those are what are extremely exciting for us, but then they need a lot of work, because these are not this is not a space where you can bring in the independent power producers. That we have a great ecosystem across globally who can come in and put these gigawatt size plants, whether solar or wind, in a matter of 15 months. But this, very local, decentralized, small kilowatt size equipment is what makes a difference also to the lives of some of the most vulnerable communities. And this is the kind of work that we are moving forward with.
Well, thank you. We'll come back to that. And Harish, Selco, you said you started Selco almost a quarter century ago, I think, or maybe more. You're really a visionary in this area. What just say some of the motivations that led you to start Selco, and then what have been the factors that have led to Selco's success in your experience?
Yeah, Selco, I would say, still is an experiment, David, with still a long way to go. For so yes, so but on the other, yeah, so the motivation obviously was at that point of time was basically can solar be a future for the poor across the world, whether it was India, whether it was any other part of the world. Can solar be the leapfrogging intervention that pushes poor in multiple ladders of the social as well as the financial ladder, so they're up in society? One of the critical ways that we did out of luck, people think, David, we have a lot of strategy. A lot of things that we did is out of luck, I guess, is that we did not take the energy path to look at energy. And what we did was, okay, what was critical for housing to succeed in any part of the world was long-term finance. What was successful for what was the failures of solar at that point of time, David, was the thousands of streetlights not work. Solar streetlights not working. Like typically, if thousands of electric grid streetlights were not working, people didn't care. But if one solar streetlight didn't work, solar does not work, right? So he had a two issue. One was the beauty of how do I look at after sale of end user financing, and second was how do you look at creating a robust after sale service, like within 24 hours for people who had lighting, and within 2 hours for people who were using lighting as a livelihood application. So we basically didn't have any policies at that point of time, solar. So what we did was we piggybacked on other policies, agricultural finance, and we piggybacked on vocational schools which had electrical courses and mechanical courses. Could we integrate solar thought process or train the graduating technicians to look at solar and work with the banks and bank managers, saying that you already have an agricultural loan of X amount of rupees. Can you integrate solar as part of your end user financing? So that's two pillars which actually led to Selco's primary. Today, none of our financing is on our balance sheet. 80% of our clients have end user financing. That's how the poorest in the country got, whether they got a financing that was dedicated for women at 3%, whether they got livelihood financing at 9%, or whether housing finance was done. It's not microfinance, David. It is a lot of people confuse consumptive finance like microfinance for solar. Solar is asset for the poor. And the only way to get poor out of poverty is asset-based financing. And so we piggybacked on the success of agricultural financing that happened in India many, many years ago in mid-70s for agricultural revolution. We piggybacked on that for the energy revolution.
It's a very important, interesting point on the finance thing. And Mansoor, I wonder if you want to pick up on that and talk about financing. And you mentioned this in some of your initial remarks, what type of financing innovations you used to scale your product in Africa.
No, I've got some quite similar experiences with Harish on this front in terms of sort of the stumbling upon the solution, right? I mean, well, one thing was fundamental in the very beginning, or that realization in the very beginning, when you're installing a solar panel and a battery and a range of appliances in someone's home, the market for people that can afford that day zero, meaning they can pay the entire price of that product day zero, is very small. And it's also a very unfair proposition because energy is a service. Energy is not a product, right? So you're making some of the poorest people in the world basically upfront buy multiple years of electricity in day zero. That's just not fair. So we have to come up with a mechanism of spreading that cost, right? How can we actually charge them daily so as they consume it? And the daily aspect was really important because at least in parts of Africa where we operate, the household economics works not on kilowatt hours or monthly. It really works on daily. How much daily do I spend on candles or batteries or kerosene, or etc.? Typically, these are daily expenditures. So we really wanted to mimic and sort of mitigate that daily expenditure people had on kerosene and stuff to actually on solar. And that's where the pay-as-you-go logic came into place, right? So could we, instead of people paying daily for kerosene or daily for charcoal or daily for candles, replace that with daily expenditure with us, where they pay with mobile money, and when they pay, the system turns on. When they don't pay, it turns off. The byproduct of all of that is that you suddenly have a receivable, meaning that if I install a system at your house, David, I have a contract with you saying that you owe me $200, $300 or $100 or $50, whatever the size of your system is, over a period of time. And if I have many customers like you, David, right, that let's say I have tens of thousands of customers like you, then I suddenly have a loan book. Then now that loan book becomes really interesting of what you can do with it. So what we at Bboxx has been able to do is to actually use receivable financing, off-balance sheet financing, different forms of securitization to be able to actually mobilize close to $400 million worth of capital into end customers, right? And that sort of link between the business model and the financing becomes really interesting. The final point I would point out in the financing world, someone has to take the risk. And this was some of the one of the earliest challenges that we faced, that people that live in darkness are literally in many ways forgotten or ignored population, in the sense that very little data exists on them. The only data that exists is averages. There's no individual data in the sense, who is David? What is David's credit score? Sorry, I'm picking on you, but as an example of it. The really interesting thing about pay-as-you-go in particular is that the byproduct is an enormous amount of data. Because you have like the data from the system in terms of consumption patterns, etc. You have payment history, so payment data. So in other words, you have behavioral data that's coming as a byproduct of the business model that helps you to actually assign a behavioral prediction. In other words, a credit score to that client or to that portfolio. And when we started linking those things together of that credit scoring with the business model, with talking to financial institutions, you suddenly had something that people could remove the prejudice, look at the numbers, look at the data, and make informed credit choices. And that's been one of the biggest ways for us to accelerate growth in our business in Africa. Of course, there's still a lot to be done. And don't let me get anyone wrong here. The majority of people still remain unelectrified, and there's still tons to be done, but those are sort of small achievements at our company that has helped us to reach our scale today.
And Mansoor, is that credit evaluation done at the like family or individual level, or at the community level, or how does that work exactly?
It's done at the household level. So the credit score is at the household level, but what goes into it is multiple things. So one factor is the behavior of the neighbors, right? So it tends to be a good indicator for community, etc. But the important thing here, David, is that day zero, we know very little. We know, like, in terms of generally speaking, how the performance in this area has been, customer of that profile, how they tend to behave, but we know very little. So that's why when we go into the household, we go fairly naked. And it takes us 3 to 6 months to build up a prediction that's statistically valid for years to come, right? And it's often that 3 to 6 months, if something goes wrong, the mistake is typically ours, in the sense that we either oversold something, meaning that the system should have been smaller, right? So the affordability should have been better. Or, for example, that we have undersold him, that it actually doesn't meet the needs that he was the household was expecting. So in majority of the cases, when we look at a credit performance issue, especially in the first 6 months, it tends to relate to our own operations. And in some ways, although that's a more embarrassing outcome, it is an outcome that is easier to fix. And that's been a key part of our focus of right-sizing the product for the consumer day zero. That's critical for the success of the first 6 months.
Thank you. We have lots of questions that are coming in. There's one on renewable energy that I want to ask you about in a moment, Gauri, and kind of the availability of renewable power. But I have a request to everyone in the audience. If you have questions, if you can put them in the question and answer box in the bottom here, kind of the bottom right, if you see, I'm having a very hard, we have so many questions coming in the chat and so many comments. I'm scrolling through dozens of them and trying to see them, but it's a little bit easier to see if you drop them in that box called question and answer. But I'm gonna try to get to everything that I see here. Gauri, there's a question about whether we have enough renewable power from an attendee. This person lives in California, notes that during the heat wave in California, there was a remarkable heat wave there about a week ago. They had renewables only about 10% of the electrical generation at night. There's a big need to scale up battery storage. As we transition to renewable power, in your view, is there a concern about the availability of renewable power and whether that's going to be adequate for the needs that we have?
So David, let me just put it in the context of how much is electricity as a part of the larger energy mix. And you'll be surprised that it's just barely 21% of the total final energy consumption, which means that we are still not living in the kind of electrified world that we think we are. we've got a long way to go. And, you know, IRENA analysis does show that by 2050, we would have reached almost about 58% of electrification. So electricity will become the major carrier. Now, to the question of whether we have enough renewable power in the grid, I don't think so, because I think, you know, this is, there is a very small percentage. It's growing very rapidly. We know that there is almost about 300 gigawatts that gets added every year. But we still, if we are to be able to make it to the 1.5 degree, which is really what we all as a global community hope for, we need to be adding almost 800 gigawatts. So there's a long way to go. And also, I think, you know, it's, but the good thing is that there's no real lack of renewable energy resources. So it's about how policies incentivize more renewables to come into the grid. Because I think, as you said very correctly, the technologies are all here. The intent is there, but it needs the kind of push that we did see the fossil fuels get in the initial years, which means really redirecting a lot of subsidy that's still going to fossil fuels into renewables to give it that push.
Thank you. We have a question from Ellen Morris, who's been a leader on this topic, about the gender dimensions of this issue. And it's actually directed to you, Harish. So we'll start with you. And then maybe go to Mansoor, and we'll start with the two men, and then go to you, Gauri, on this topic. But Harish, could talk about the gender dimensions of the Selco approach, and how innovation looks different through a gender lens.
Thanks, Trust Ellen to post that question. There are two parts to this. See, one is the way we're trying to approach is that how do we institutionalize SDG 7 in other SDGs? The end goal is better health services. The end goal is better livelihoods. The end goal is better education. That is better water, right? And how do we look at better agriculture? For example, agriculture or health. And if I look at health, okay, what is the most efficient building? What is the most efficient appliances in the maternal labor room? Design the building in a way that you have great daylighting and airflow. Then solar comes in. Today, what happens is a lot of the design comes from a demand, from the supply side perspective, not from a demand side perspective. The demand side perspective gives in innovations in terms of efficiency of appliances. Why? Like when I design solar for a sewing machine, we get blamed to be expensive. Nobody criticizes the sewing machine to be inefficient, or a financial product to be more expensive. I think it's the holistic way of looking at implementation, and that's what we look at. And while we're looking at those innovations, primarily lot of the existing livelihood products. I mean, it's easy to look at the gender lens from the health side, but I'll go to a livelihood side. Many of the applications are not women-centric. For example, how many blacksmithies are women? Like, for example, if I have, let's look at a rice mill, right? If it's run by diesel power and the power goes off, to run the diesel engine, you not only need a man, but you need a strong man to start the diesel engine. With an electric solar powered rice mill, switch of a button, you actually run it. Second, for example, pottery making. The drudgery prevents the gender from taking up pottery. A solar powered pottery machine or a solar powered hammer mill for blacksmithy suddenly opens up livelihood opportunities for the whole sect of gender, which are women, that was not previously. Now, solar has democratized livelihood options for women in sectors which they were not part of because of drudgery. So the beauty of SDG 7 and looking at solutions for opportunities in the energy poverty sector is that it will push innovations to a level where there will be reverse flow of innovations from the underdeveloped part to the developed part, because it brings in efficiency, it brings in design thinking, it brings in a holistic society which is socially and environmentally sustainable.
Thank you. Mansoor, what's been your experience on gender issues in your work?
Look, our business is B2C, household by household by household, and one overwhelming reality is that mothers play a critical role in the household choice of transitioning to cleaner forms of energy, right? Because there's a sense of aspiration at the household level. We talk about electricity itself, a lot of the driver of having basic electricity, when we don't talk about TVs and the fun stuff, it comes really from mothers in a society. And that's something we see in our sales agent network as well, that our more successful sales agents in that category are women, because they're able to actually communicate that fact maybe a bit better than men can. On clean cooking, it's overwhelmingly a choice by women, right? It's the women that has to be convinced that I am going to move away from charcoal or firewood to LPG or another form of biomass clean cooking solution, right? And particularly in Africa, there's often quite concerns about recipes. Charcoal, I've learned, is not just a fuel; it's actually an ingredient. So it's also about that education process as well. So I fully agree with Harish in terms of that actually the energy transition and the new economy that it brings with it, it actually is an extremely open, equitable, inclusive solution for every member of society, and is much more level playing field for every member of society, including women.
Gauri, how did the men do in answering this question? And any other thoughts on this topic?
No, I think they did quite well. And in fact, just to take it further, David, that, although we typically consider farming as a very male-dominated, work, but actually it's the women that do most of the work. And, in a lot of countries, the electricity that used to get supplied and still get supplied to the agriculture fields is at night. So you can imagine, how difficult it is to be doing those very many agriculture activities when you get electricity at night, and which is also for a very short period. And when when you see villages shifting to solar, whether it's solar pumping or solar sprinklers and drip sets, the whole game changes. And I think also I just want to really emphasize this point which Harish made, that when you're getting into solar, you're also designing efficient equipment, and equipment that gets much more focused on the user, because you don't have those heavy equipments that they expect men to use, but actually it is the women who end up using it, and with a lot of difficulty.
Thank you. We have some questions on really kind of news events and current developments that are happening now, and one question from Fateh Belaid about current energy price surge, something I mentioned at the beginning, and what the implications of that are on this issue. And I wonder, do any of our panelists like to speak to that? We have these skyrocketing energy prices. What's that doing around the world in terms of energy poverty?
I can maybe just chip in a few points. In the short term is terrible, right? Like everyone is suffering from the fact that things cost more, and the poorest in the world, unfortunately, again, in as many cases, will probably, unfortunately, suffer disproportionately even more than the average of the world. In the midterm, it might actually help the transition to renewables. Because I think now, as Gauri mentioned in the beginning, solar still remains the cheapest source of electricity. In particular, similar arguments can be made for many other sources of renewable as well. Renewables are highly cost competitive. And I think one of the new aspects that I'm seeing more of is that energy security is becoming an important factor of the choice of energy that people put in countries. The fact that renewable sources in, I think, nearly all cases, maybe except hydrogen, doesn't actually require an ongoing fuel, means that you reduce your geopolitical risk of that asset, right? So it's there, the sun will rise, the wind will blow, right? There's few forces that could probably stop that, right? So that's maybe an acceleration towards renewable in the midterm. But of course, projects like that will take time to come online. And in the short term, I think governments really need to act very fast. When I say governments, I'm talking about multilateral organizations in helping provide that sort of subsidies and relief and other economic aid that's necessary, that we don't reverse the achievements of the last 20 years in the next 7 years to come.
Thank you for that. Other thoughts? Well, we have a question from Nasser Hamid in Pakistan. And Pakistan, of course, has been devastated by terrible impacts of climate change in the past month. I mean, from accounts I've read, a third of the country is underwater and just tremendous humanitarian disaster. And I wonder, any thoughts? I guess that the question is directed to you, Mansoor, about whether you have operations in Pakistan, but or does anyone have any thoughts about this topic and how to bring aid to the people of Pakistan?
I'm from Pakistan, so I was there actually 2 weeks ago, and climate change is real. I mean, if someone ever doubts that, this sort of disasters brings them to light. But the other thing brings to light as well is, again, the fact that climate change has a disproportionate effect on the poor, right? And that I think is also a reality that we're seeing in the floods in Pakistan. We have some small scale operations in Pakistan, both on the solar side, and we also do a lot of our software development there. And I hope that things will get better.
So David, if I step in, see the issue, what's happening, including Pakistan, which was really in a bad shape, which is also happening in other parts of the world. But what it showed was that we are getting too much into these negotiations where we believe that mitigation is better than adaptation, but not realizing that if a lot of the philanthropic monies and tax monies went into adaptation, a lot of the poor will not slip into multiple rungs. I mean, I'm sure it's going to take generations of families in those areas of Pakistan to get out of poverty. The tax dollars are not going to fund them. Had adaptation monies gone in so that less number of houses, less number of livelihoods would have been lost, that would have led to future mitigation. And I think people should stop looking at the semantics of adaptation versus mitigation, because we get larger carbon numbers in adaptation. And so, sorry, in mitigation. So adaptation is not what we should do. I think that has to stop, because the poor are suffering today. And more allocations of adaptation needs to go in. For example, much better housing methodologies for flood affected areas with efficiency, better solar pumps that are at a higher height, for example, immediate livelihood options that can happen as soon as the waters recede. Those are things that DRE can actually come up with. So would request the climate negotiators, the climate funders, as well as other philanthropists to keep allocating, having adaptation as a more critical than just mitigation.
So David, I'd just like to add my 2 cents worth. I think it's such a double whammy that the poor face, that A, there is energy poverty, but B, they are the ones who actually end up paying the highest price for accessing energy. Because especially in situations like this, when there is, and we know in South Asia that this is how the market starts to behave, you have black markets that really shoots the price up for, and then, the poor just slip into a state where they're just not able to access even the basic needs for the energy going ahead. So I can't agree more. And I'd said in the beginning that I think not enough discussions and actions are being taken on the energy poverty and energy access front. I think there's a lot of talk, but ultimately, sometimes you feel you're talking to the choir. So you're not really being able to reach out to the new and other larger actors who can play a role and really get more money and funding into this very critical issue.
We have a number of questions on a controversial topic in some places, which is the role of fossil fuels in fighting energy poverty. One of our questions from Tara Layefa Ingo, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, says, how can energy poverty be addressed in sub-Saharan Africa vis-a-vis the energy transition, whose socioeconomic development is largely dependent on fossil fuel sourced energy, especially oil and gas? I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on that topic. I'm not surprised. It's a
no, I think David, it's as you've seen in Europe, it's not, we are not in a position to just switch off one fuel source and switch on to the other. It's a process. That's why we're calling it a transition. But the whole idea is that, is there a strong intent in making that cleaner transition into cleaner energies? Because that intent has to be backed by not just policies, but also public sector monies going into it to leverage private sector and to attract much more private sector funding, which is going to be the mainstay of how deployment in renewables is going to increase.
If I can add to that, David, to what Gauriji said, the Sub-Saharan Africa, they say, does not have a lot of the baggage right now. And it's a great opportunity for us to phase out in a much faster way. But what we need to think about is when we talk about Sub-Saharan Africa, we need to think about the original concept of how roads and airports were financed in the developed and the overdeveloped world. None of the roads in the world make money. None of the airports make money. Because we fly leads to an added benefit that the airports, none of the airports in the world are sustainable, but how are they financed over a long periods of time? So when we look at energy and DRE and this, and one needs to put in a lot of capital to create those assets from a long-term perspective that leads to multiple people getting out of poverty. And that's not actually subsidy. That's a future benefit, because those people become taxpayers, then will pay for taxes, just like how US education is free till 12th, because the kids will go and pay taxes, subsidizing the next set of kids. I think we need to look at Africa creating larger applications of renewable energy that is so-called subsidy, but we argue that airports get the same amount of money, which is the biggest subsidy that the middle class of the world and above middle class of the world is taking. And it's high time we put that money into better use and phase out fossil fuels in Africa.
The way I look at energy poverty, I would sort of divide it up into three categories at the household level. Again, I'm talking about household level. You have the need for electricity, for appliances, lighting, etc. And I think the case for it being 100% renewable there is super strong. Then you get into the second category of cooking, right? There, actually, electric cooking remains generally very expensive. So do you need to look at some sort of transition fuel, right? So there's a lot of things that are better than charcoal. There's a lot of things that are better than firewood. Are they completely carbon zero or negative? No, right? So, but it's still a lot better from a health perspective and from a environmental perspective. And in that case, I think like things like LPG plays a critical role in the clean cooking space, where there is a role for fossil fuel in lifting up people out of poverty. Then in terms of mobility, that's another critical thing here as well. Like there's some quite scary statistics in many parts of Africa, where a large percentage of the population in the last 12 months have not taken any other mode of transportation than their own mode of transportation, right? So meaning they have no access to mobility. It's in double-digit percentages, right? So it's huge problem, so of course, like getting EV, which is a transition here in Europe. I'm sitting in London right now. Is a choice that people are making, and normally people that are more well off are able to make that choice. Making that choice today in places that are less well off is just unfair, right? So of course people need to be able to get their motorbikes and cars and other things like that. And maybe there is a room for, as Harish just mentioned, in terms of like creating that public infrastructure of roads and airports, etc. That's necessary, but I think using the same lens for the energy transition for the West versus the emerging world is super unfair on the citizens of those countries.
So fossil fuels have a role, at least in cooking and in transportation in the short term, to maybe to some lesser extent in power is what I think what I hear you saying. Yeah. And any other thoughts on this topic? This is such an important policy topic that's getting attention in lots of different places. One of the big questions is, and one of our somebody in the audience asked us about financing for fossil fuels, and presumably if the services need to be provided, then financing needs to be provided as well, I would think. But
David, that's where I'm saying that. So I think we should not compare financing of renewables, and especially for the energy poverty, with financing of fossil fuels. We should look at how can we piggyback on financing that is happening for irrigation, agriculture, health sector on that, and think how can we complement those financing and make DRE making it much more financially viable. So you're already going to finance a rice mill, for example, and a solar powered rice mill actually is more economically viable to be financed. So can we piggyback on the other sectors, right? It's not about A versus B, but look at what the end result needs to be, like the health financing, the livelihood financing, etc., and get into that. So then more money is actually open up.
And this gets into issues involving subsidies, of course, where there have been large historic subsidies for fossil fuels as well. Yeah. We have a question from Elliot David, a former student of mine, a former STAR student of mine, who's now at SBP. And to move to a different topic, he's asking about really the financial viability of renewables and helping to improve that. And so one of the big challenges is that project developers can't monetize all their production, and curtailment makes project deployment more difficult. I'd love to hear from some of our panelists if they think that off-takers such as battery storage or flexible loads such as data centers could help be enabling solutions for renewables. Gauri, maybe that's a question that you could address.
No, absolutely, David. And I think, this is a big issue as far as renewables is concerned. I mean, you do have, at least on paper, the policy that renewables should have a must-run status. But we do see that, there is a curtailment that happens all the time. And which is what, creates that, I think what's being asked about whether it's feasible or not. But I still think that as far as off-takers are concerned, we've been talking to a lot of governments, and there is a growing realization that you can't be dealing with renewables the same way you deal with the more centralized coal plants or the gas-fired plants. But unfortunately, the must-run status that needs to be there and to be almost sacrosanct in terms of making sure that it remains. There's still a long way. Policies and regulators need to really be much more mindful of pushing the envelope on this.
Harish, Mansoor, any additional thoughts there? Mansoor, there's a question specifically directed to you about physical security of the system and whether you're experiencing challenges with that on issues like theft and vandalism or extreme weather. Has that been a challenge in your business? And if so, how are you dealing with that?
To be very honest, it's very small part of our portfolio that suffers from that sort of issues. We have multiple sort of levels of ability to manage that. So number one is that the asset itself, we can switch it on and off remotely. That's sort of a big preventer of any issues. The second thing is we can monitor the device remotely, so we can see if any tampering attempts are taking place, etc. And this is all because of IoT is possible to do at such a low cost nowadays. The third thing is that we have the geolocation of every device physically, so we can see exactly where each device is. So it's all monitored and controlled, etc. from that perspective. Worst case, if someone defaults for a long period of time, we ask them for voluntary repossession. So meaning that if the device is really not useful to them, then they should voluntarily allow us to repossess it. And in exchange for that voluntary repossession, we make them a payment. So for a payment, they would voluntarily allow us to get that system back. And that. I mean, we have a asset loss rate that is a single digit, very low single digit, which allows us it to be financeable. Theft, honestly, it depends. The theft, the main issues are in urban areas, in urban centers, and mostly it's theft of solar panel itself, right, on the rooftop that's sort of facing outside. That happens from time to time. It's just part of the cost of doing business in some locations. It's a little bit difficult to control an item sitting outside, but still it remains a very small percentage of the overall portfolio.
And David, to consider, I'm glad when it gets stolen because somebody's going to use it somewhere else and save it.
That's true. That's true. There's a positive way of looking at
it. and that means the awareness has gone so well that people are actually stealing it. So we are, because somebody's going to install and somebody's going to ask, where did you get it from? They'll have to sell it. They got it from Bboxx and said, then so Bboxx is another one, right? So the question is, there are mechanisms, for example, in some cases where we put an alarm as soon as somebody cuts the wire from the panel, from the controller, there's an alarm in the house which actually wakes up. But it's been less than, I would say, less than 50 over the last 25 years that systems that I have seen getting stolen. But
well, we're running low on time. We've got about 5 minutes left, and one, I want to be sure if there are any themes that are really important that we haven't touched on. I want to invite any of from Gauri, Harish, or Mansoor to speak up on those and make sure that we cover all the important points. And as we close out, if you have any stories that you think are memorable, you'd like to share, I always find that's a great, the stories stick in people's minds. So any stories, I'd welcome those. And I have so many questions. I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to every question that's been asked here, but there's a number of questions that have come in, particularly directed at you, Harish, about the connection between agriculture and solar, and both at the financing level and the project development level. I wonder if you've touched on that a little bit, just maybe say a little bit more about that, and how this works in your mind, and how we make sure that both energy access and then agricultural development go hand in hand.
See, many of the things and I'll also put my wrap-up comments there, is many of the agricultural loans, and especially in the early 70s, were designed on the crop cycles. Like a paddy farmer gets a 5-year loan with payments and balloon payments in every January, because that's when he or she sells a harvest. A peanut farmer twice a year, a sugarcane farmer twice a year, and as such, same thing, a street vendor on a daily basis. So it's not, sometimes we focus too much on technology and push it. It's the financing product. Like a street vendor needs to have a product that he or she can pay on a daily. But as classically somebody said, 300 rupees a month is expensive, but 10 rupees a day is fine. But the issue is because the cash flow is on a daily basis, and for a paddy farmer, it's once a year. How do you actually create? And that's where we piggybacked on the agriculture system. But to close the story, as you said, but my question is, we need to cheat from other models, and somewhere we get stuck between affordability and low cost. These are two different things. Like a more expensive sewing machine might be more affordable than a cheaper sewing machine, because he or she can actually produce more that can actually lead to payments of bank loan as well as our own income, right? So to simple example, how do you reach out to people who earn less than 25 cents a day? And the issue with 25 cents a day is that they want the kid to have a better lighting or themselves to have a better lighting. It's not the question they want solar light. So what we did was we reversed India's midday meal scheme, where the kitchens in schools were providing meals so that the kids could go to school. So we reversed it. We said we put up solar panels in school as an educational infrastructure, the battery and light at home. With the battery less than the weight of a lunch box, the kid comes to the mother, says, I don't care whether you study or not, go to school because I need the battery to be charged, right? So then the kid, so you reverse the model of a midday meal scheme, right? It's how do we come up with holistic models and analogies of how water is delivered? Can I look at energy? How is credit card, American Express come up with a new credit card product? Can I actually look at energy? So I think we need to diversify ourselves into a systems thinking for decentralized energy rather than just focusing on solar panels and batteries.
That's great. And that makes me realize, you said earlier that you thought some of Selco's success was due to luck. I don't know. My father used to tell me you make your own luck, and I think you made your own luck here, Harish. I think a lot of what you've done at Selco is your vision and skill. So thank you for your leadership on this over so many years. Mansoor, just have a few minutes left. Any final reflections, and then I'll turn to Gauri for our last words.
I think it's that sort of human stories about like what people do with energy. Like, I mean, the few things that come to mind are a customer I met in Rwanda who bought a solar system and started a barbershop, and I met him again a few years later, and he had 2 barbershops, right? So that aspect of that sort of the micro entrepreneurship, and it's changes life in more than one way. And I think that is really the sort of the thing that keeps me really excited, is that potential of the electricity ensuring that acceptable human life and the potential that can come from that.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your vision and work on this, Mansoor. Gauri, you've got the last word.
Thanks, David. I think one of the points that's come out so clearly in this discussion, and thanks to both Harish and Mansoor for it, is this completely wrong notion that the poor are not bankable, or the poor are a huge perceived risk. If you look at how the banks have created these bad loans or the NPAs, you will see that it's a very small portion that is a NPA coming from the smaller loans that they might have given to the to the poorer. And I think this whole question of why renewables is still considered as a perceived risk by financing entities, I think that really needs to be questioned, because we have examples after examples where it's very clear that this is not a risky domain that we are entering into, and there are many best practices and models that can be picked up to move this agenda forward.
Well, thank you, everyone. Huge thanks to Gauri, Harish, and Mansoor, not just for appearing today, but for all your work on this topic. Thank you to Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy and the Zayed Sustainability Prize. Thank you in particular to Yasser and to Sharifa and Caitlin for your work on pulling all of this together. One final thought as we close. I've moderated and participated in many Zoom events over the past several years, as I'm sure many people here have as well. I don't think I've ever participated in one that had as much active participation from the audience as this one has had. And I think dozens of countries, I think. I mean, it's quite remarkable. So that gives me hope. I think we have a global community that's working on this topic, and that's what we need for change. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our hosts, and look forward to our next chance to connect. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.